Alright, so in this video, I'm going to start looking at how movement's working and think about what we can do to make it feel better. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the slippery and the slow sections of my level because I just want to, for now, let's just get a bigger stretch of the normal default ground to test with and at least get that feeling good before we start getting fancy. So we'll go ahead and move those down there and stretch out the big green one that's just our default um, no physics material on it floor. And just to remember, if we look at our player character and we find its box collider 2D, which is the collider that's actually contacting the floor, it has the player physics material on it here with a friction of 1.5. So if we run the game now, we can kind of see what this is like. And so my sensibility is that it takes too long to get moving and it takes too long to stop. That's what I think. So actually there's also another issue here where if I jump while I'm still running, I kind of slow down and stop before I get going again, and I don't like that either. So those are the issues we're going to try and fix. So first of all, if my initial issue is that, well, I want to start running faster, I might be thinking, well, why don't I reduce the friction on the player? That will help me get going faster. Or alternatively, I could crank up this acceleration force on the player, which is already up to 40. I mean, I could put that at like 60 or 80 or 100 even. Let's just see. And now, I'm moving sooner, which is good. That feels more responsive, but I'm stopping uh, slower, meaning I feel like I'm sliding a lot, even worse than before, right? Now, same thing. I could go into the player and be like, well, maybe I can fix that by increasing the friction. And then that's just going to cause the same issue where it takes longer to get going. And even that felt too slippery. I could try like 10. I'm starting to stop a little faster, but it's hard to get going again now. Remember, physics materials are one of the weird Unity things that won't actually, um, if you make a change to this while the game's running, it won't actually kick in until you stop the game and run it again, which is kind of annoying. Let's try something even more. Let's try 20. Now I stop pretty well, but it's like I have to hold the move button for like a second before I start moving. So this something has to change. So since it seems like there's just no way I can tweak these numbers to get the behavior I'm looking for, I'm gonna have to come up with an alternative strategy. And what I think I'm gonna do is create at least two different physics materials for my player to solve these problems at least. So one physics material will be for when I'm trying to move, and I would want the friction on that to be low so it's easy to start moving. And then the other would be a higher friction physics material that I'll switch to when I'm trying to stop. And that way I can still accelerate in a fluid, intuitive way, but also stop in an intuitive way that feels responsive. So let's try and set that up, and that's going to take some code as well as making a couple of new physics materials. Let's go ahead and create the physics materials first. So inside my physics material directory here, I'm going to right click, I'm going to create a new physics material 2D, and I'm going to call it player moving. And then I'm just going to make one more physics material 2D, and I'm going to call this one player stopping. And I'm just gonna go delete my original player physics material because I need two of them now, and this one doesn't help me. So we'll go ahead and delete the original player physics material, and I'm left with, um, if you adjust the slider, we can see the full name, player moving, player stopping. All right. So in theory, we want player moving to be lower friction, so it's easier to get moving. So we'll say something like 0.2. And again, these numbers, who knows what's right? We're going to have to experiment. And then player stopping, let's go up to like, I don't know, 2 or 3. We'll just see how that works. And so the next step is going to be to write some code so that we're dynamically swapping the physics material that is being used um, from player moving to player stopping based on whether or not the player is trying to move or stop. So I guess we had better plug one of these in right off the bat. So um, if you click on your player character and find his box collider here, I didn't mean to check that, sorry. We need to put something back in here. So when you start the game, you're likely stopping. So we'll just put player stopping in, but it's not a huge issue. If you pick player moving first, no big deal. And then we need to go back to our scripts folder here and open up our player character script. So right off the bat, I know that I need to have my script here needs to know about those two physics materials. And so an easy way to do that is just to make serialized fields for them and then plug them in the editor. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to make a serialized field of the type, so it'll be private physics material 2D. There it is. And I'm going to name it just like I named those, except with beginning with a lowercase. So it will be player moving. Well, maybe I should be a little more explicit. Player moving physics material. And I'm going to go ahead and add 2 in the same line here. So I'll put a comma after that name and we'll say player stopping physics material. Alright. Now, these names may seem extra long, but again, I just want to make sure that I'm being very clear and there's no ambiguity about what these things are. If I just named it player moving, maybe somebody thinks that's, who knows what someone thinks that is. I want to make sure that if somebody looks at this code and they see this variable, they know exactly what it is. It's the player moving physics material. Alright, so I've got these slotted in to be exposed to the editor. So let's go ahead and plug them in the editor before I forget. So we'll switch back to Unity. Make sure you saved your script and then switch back to Unity and select your player character. And we need to find our player character script here and plug in the two physics materials that we are dealing with. So player moving will go in the player moving spot, and player stopping will go in the player stopping spot. Alright, so now that I've plugged those two physics materials in on my script in the editor, let's go back to the script and start writing the code to actually switch between them. So what I'm going to do, this is something that's going to need to update every frame while the player's moving. And I could just start typing it into the update function, but I'm going to actually just write a new function called update physics material and then call that an update, just so we can keep our update nice and organized and easy to read. So I'll make a new function here, private void update physics material. And we'll make sure that we call it an update before we forget. maybe I can actually get away with calling this in fixed update even, uh, just to be a little more uh, efficient. So we'll try putting it there, and if it doesn't feel like it's fast enough, we can actually go back and move it into update. So we'll call update physics material in here. And we might as well make sure we're calling it before we start moving, um, just so that we have the correct physics material in place before we try and move. Now I'm going to kind of reorganize my script a little because things are sort of all over the place. So I'm going to move my fixed update function here. I'm going to go ahead and move it up next to my regular update just so that's easier to find both updates in the same sort of spot in the script. And then just kind of get rid of some of the extra white space we've accumulated here. Alright, so this looks a little better. So what is the update physics material gonna do? Well, it needs to know when we're going to switch to the moving physics material and when we're going to switch to the stopped physics material. And so in order to figure that out, we should maybe figure out if the player's trying to move. So if we look at this horizontal input variable we've created, this thing will be 0 if the player's not trying to move, or it will be, not 0 if the player is trying to move. So we can look at the absolute value of this variable, because if the player's moving left, it'll be in the negatives. If the player's trying to move right, it'll be in the positives. So we can look at the absolute value of this and compare it to 0 and use that to decide whether or not we are trying to move or stop. So we'll write an if statement and we'll say if mathf.abs, this is just how you get absolute value. So if the absolute value of our horizontal input is greater than 0, then we will want to use the moving physics material. And otherwise, we will use the stopping physics material. And I'm just putting comments here because we're actually not quite ready to just switch that, because the physics material belongs to a game object, or a component rather, that we don't have a reference to. If you look at Unity, you can remember that the physics material is part of this box collider 2D. So if I want to change this property in code, I need a reference to this component, this box collider 2D component. So I had to set that up next. And since I've just been making all my other references by exposing variables to the editor and dragging them in, I guess I'll just keep following that pattern. So we'll make another serialized field here, and we'll say private collider 2D. It doesn't really matter if it's a box collider or a capsule collider or a circle collider. We just want a collider 2D here, and we will call it, we need to give it a name that helps us understand this is the collider that's making contact with the ground. So we can say player ground collider, and we'll save the script and go back to Unity, and we should have a new spot in our script here to plug that in. And so we're going to drag the collider that's actually got the physics material on it, the box collider. This is the collider that's contacting the ground, as opposed to the circle collider that we're using to check for ground. The circle collider is a trigger. It doesn't actually contact the ground. The player's not standing on this collider. it's standing on this one. So we need to make sure we drag this box collider into the player ground collider variable we've exposed to the editor here. Alright, so let's go back to script. And now, back where we have this comment, we can say player ground collider dot physics material. Actually, it's just called shared material equals moving, player moving physics material. There we go. And then in this line here, we'll replace our comment with player ground collider dot shared material equals player stopping physics material. And we'll save the game. Alright. So now, if we save our script and go back to Unity, we can see if this is working. Now we may not have the actual fine-tuned movement that we like, but what we should have is we should be able to watch this physics material that's plugged in to our box collider 2D here and see it change based on whether we're trying to move or stop. So that's what I'm going to be looking for when I run the game here. And so I can see when I'm moving, it says player moving here. And when I'm stopping, it says player stopping. And that's good. Now, one thing that's going on that I notice here, I'm just using the mouse and keyboard as I play test. I can tell, like, for a bit of time after I release the D button or the arrow key to move, it doesn't instantly switch to the player stopping here. And that's kind of a misleading or a difficult to understand issue, at least if you've never run into it before. And the reason is that Unity, by default, if you use get axis, will sort of ramp up from 0 to 1 as you press the movement keys on the keyboard, instead of just immediately giving you a -1 or a 1 when you try to move. And I think this is meant to sort of emulate the more smooth progression you would get with an analog stick, but it just doesn't feel right for me on my keyboard. So I think we can circumvent this issue by using a different function that's similar to get axis, but instead it's going to be get axis raw. So find where we're getting our horizontal input here. So we have this function, update horizontal input. And rather than calling input.getAxis, I'm going to call input.getAxis raw. And you can see here it says it returns the value with no smoothing filtering applied. And I think that will feel a little more responsive to me. So I'm going to save it. And now if I run my game, I think it's going to swap my physics materials more responsively based on when I'm pressing or not pressing the move keys. Yeah, it's like instant now. In fact, now my movement is starting to feel pretty dang good actually. No, and I no longer have this problem where when I jump and then land on the ground again, I slow down. I have like a pretty steady movement. So this is feeling a lot better. At this point, you might want to just tweak your acceleration and your stopping and moving frictions until the game feels pretty decent to you. Another idea would be to go back and replace the slippery and the slow platforms so that you can test how they work also. So I'm going to go scale back down my normal ground. I'm going to put the slippery ground in and then put the slow ground in and go ahead and test how each of these feels. Now you you might have wondered when we were setting up the physics materials themselves, like why even bother having any value here for the player moving friction? And the reason I don't want to just use 0 is because I do want to have the ability to have like more slippery and more um, slow surfaces to run across. So by leaving some friction value plugged in, um, you should still be able to get a little bit of a more varied feel on different types of grounds. And again, you might just want to keep tweaking all of these physics materials and your player's acceleration until you're happy with how movement feels across all three types. Alright, so I've spent some time uh, adjusting my physics materials and my player's acceleration, and I've come up with some that I think work pretty well. So I've put in 20 for my player's acceleration force here, and I still have my max speed of 5. And I've left the player moving friction at point 0.2. That seems to work for me. My player stopping is at 3. And then my slippery is at 0.01. So this ice chunk here with the slippery physics material only has zero point zero 0.01 friction. And then the slow surface here has a friction of 2. And you could think of this one as like mud or quicksand or something like that. So here's our normal ground, here's our ice, and here's our sand or mud. And if I run the game with these values plugged in, I think it feels pretty accurate to those concepts. So you might want to try that if you're having trouble. But feel free to pick numbers you like, and that's the whole fun of making a game.